Friends, first of course, I would like to express my gratitude to the economics discussion group for giving me this opportunity to talk to the students. And I appreciate the fact that you are here in such large numbers, especially because you have had a whole morning of lecturing and so on. Wednesdays, I think, are the days when first year MA students in economics have their lectures. So I appreciate that. I'm also very grateful to Bishnupriya for giving up her time and actually sparing some effort to come and preside over this session. Many of you may not know who Bishnupriya's parents were, very famous people. You must have heard of Utpal Dutt, that is Bishnupriya's father, and his wife Shobha Sen was Bishnupriya's mother. Very legendary figures of the Indian theatre, legendary figures. Anyway, so let me get on to the subject because I want to share a number of things with you. I don't get such an opportunity anymore of talking to so many students. So I'd like to present a whole lot of ideas to you and find out how you react to them. When we talk about neoliberalism, to my mind, the essence of neoliberalism is relatively unrestricted flows of goods and services and of capital, including finance, across country borders. Okay. By the way, am I audible to everybody? I know that these days I can't speak as loudly, but I hope I'm audible. So to repeat, relatively unrestricted flows of goods and services and of capital, including especially finance, across country borders. Now the point is that if you have capital that is globalized, finance that is globalized, but we live in a world of nation states. We have an Indian state, we have a Pakistani state, we have a Greek state, and so on. So we live in a very peculiar world in which capital, including finance, is globalized, but the state remains a nation state. Now, if you have globalized finance, and I particularly emphasize finance because it can move from one country to another with one telephone call. So it can move with amazing rapidity from one country to another. So its globalization makes a very big difference. So if you have finance that is globalized, that can move around, and you have the state as a nation state, then it follows that the nation state willy-nilly must always do things which are to the liking of finance. If the nation state does not, in that case, in newspaper parlance, the confidence of the investors in that economy would be lost, which is basically that finance would get dissatisfied, displeased, and would go somewhere else. And if you have capital flights, which are fairly large, in that case, obviously, that nation gets into a financial crisis. Therefore, one of the very important features of globalization is the fact that since globalized or international finance confronts the nation state willy-nilly has to do the dictates or the demands of international finance. Now, this is a very obvious point. This point was well known to people like Keynes, who had actually advocated, if you remember, that there should be state intervention in demand management. For there to be state intervention in demand management to push a capitalist economy close to full employment, it must be the case that the state must have control over finance rather than finance having control over the state, which is why Keynes had suggested that finance must not be allowed to become international. that there must be controls on financial flows across borders. He wrote an article in 1933 in a journal called the Yale Review, in which he said that finance above all must be national. The article was about what things should be within the purview of a nation. Should there be free trade? Should there be free financial flows? To that his answer was that no, you must have finance that is national. Now, if you therefore have a nation state, but you have globalized finance, and the state does what finance wants it to do, then this has a number of implications. One implication is that as long as the country remains within this vortex of financial flows, it remains within this world of financial flows, no matter who comes to power, no matter which political formation comes to power, they all must have the same policies in the realm of the economy, and those would be the policies which are dictated by finance. In India, we have seen, you people are too young perhaps to have seen, that we had a United Front government, then we had a Congress government, then we had the BJP government, and all of these governments more or less pursue very similar very similar economic policies. Now, therefore, that has very important implications when democracy is concerned, because democracy entails that before the electorate, there must be a choice between different political formations which differ in their economic policies. Obviously, some political formation would have a different economic policy compared to another. Only then the choice of the people between them really makes a difference. But on the other hand, if they all have the same, or even those who actually profess to have a different political, to have a different economic policy, perchance get into power, then having got into power, unless they decide to opt out of this world of financial flows, they would be forced to have the same economic policies by betraying the promises they had made to the electorate before they got elected. I mean, very recently, for instance, in Greece, Syriza, which was a left-wing political formation, came to power. And when it came to power, because Syriza did not opt out of this world of finance, it actually pursued exactly the same policies that all previous formations were pursuing, even though Syriza's entire electoral promise was that it would not do what the previous ones had done. So, firstly, all political formations then begin to pursue the same kinds of economic policies, or even profess to, or if they don't profess, they betray the promises they had made earlier. The second thing, which is of course equally important, is that in terms of the content of these policies, what happens is that that there are a number of things that globalized finance wants the state to do, and a number of things it doesn't want the state to do. One of the things that it does not want the state to do is that the state must not support, promote, defend, protect petty production, including peasant agriculture. In other words, petty production, including peasant agriculture, which is one very important, perhaps the most important example of petty production, must be allowed to be encroached upon by big capital. And you see, this is something which basically implies that a whole paraphernalia of measures which the Indian government had instituted. By the way, there's a chair free here. You can come and sit here because I'm going to be speaking for some time, so that's available. So, a whole set of measures which, let's say, the Indian government had instituted earlier in support of the peasantry, which my colleague Abhijit Sen, who passed away the other day, was responsible to a very large extent in implementing. Now, those measures like price support, procurement prices, actual procurement by the Food Corporation of India from the farmers. In 22 crops, we actually have procurement prices, food grain crops and so on. So all these measures, price support measures, input subsidy measures and so on, which actually kept peasant agriculture afloat, ensured that peasant agriculture had a certain minimum rate of profit, those measures have to be abandoned. And this is, no previous government in India had the courage to confront the peasantry by abandoning them. They abandoned them in the case of cash crops. Earlier you had price support by all these commodity boards like tea board, coffee board, rubber board, coir board and so on. All that is gone. The boards exist, but their marketing intervention role is gone. So price support has been withdrawn as far as cash crops are concerned, but price support still continues when it comes to food grains. And of course, the 3 farm laws against which the farmers went for on a year's agitation were really meant to withdraw the price support. Now, these farm laws were not the brainchild of the Modi government. These farm laws are a part of the logic of neoliberalism, and these farm laws, in fact, were there because of the fact that even the WTO has been putting pressure on India. So the point is that the defense of petty production is something that goes in a neoliberal regime. By the way, one of the consequences of the government withdrawing price support to cash crops is hundreds and thousands of suicides of peasants that you have had over the last few years because of the fact that they take a loan, but on the other hand they can't pay back the loan because of the fact that the price they get is not adequate, and therefore many of them are driven to suicide. Now, if you have a withdrawal of price support or a withdrawal of government support measures for peasant agriculture, then peasant agriculture becomes unviable. If input subsidies are withdrawn, if price support is not forthcoming, or even if it's forthcoming, the procurement prices announced are simply not large enough. I once made a calculation, it may take me too long to discuss it. I once made a calculation, I'll tell you. The calculation was the following. When I joined JNU in 1973, actually 74 officially, in 73 I was a visiting professor, the basic pay of an associate professor, which is the level at which I had joined JNU, was 700 rupees per month. That was the basic pay. At that time, the procurement price of a quintal of wheat was about 70 rupees. So let's say 1:10. Now, the basic pay of an associate professor in JNU would be what? Basic starting pay, at least 50,000, let us say. Associate professor, perhaps more, but at least 50,000. On the other hand, the procurement price of a quintal of wheat, 1,500. In other words, 1,500 to 50,000, which is actually 1:30 at least, if not more. And mind you, professors, not a privileged lot. I'm talking about academics. They are not a privileged lot. Even so, you can imagine what the position of the peasantry is vis-a-vis the position even of professors who are not a privileged lot. But therefore, peasant agriculture becomes unviable. If peasant agriculture becomes unviable, then of course you find that a lot of peasants then migrate to cities in search of employment because they just abandon agriculture. Between 1991 and 2011 censuses, the number of cultivators, the census calls it cultivators, fell by 15 million. Now, of which some may have become laborers, but others obviously migrated to cities. When you migrate to cities, you come to the second characteristic of neoliberalism, and that is the following. To the extent that you have free flow of goods and services, trade has got opened up. Now Indian producers have to compete against producers from other countries. Earlier you had protection, but if protectionist barriers are removed, then competition gets intensified. And one of the ways in which this intensification of competition takes place is that then everybody tries to introduce technological progress. Whatever is the latest technology that is available, you want to get rid of it, to get hold of that in order to be able to withstand competition from other countries. Now, typically, introducing technological progress implies a rise in the rate of growth of labor productivity, because technological progress typically takes the form under capitalism of being labor saving, or if you're doing growth theory, you call it labor augmenting. Anyway, so you find that technological progress tends to be labor saving, and competition, because the market is opened up to goods and services from elsewhere, is something which intensifies the use of modern technology, and therefore there is an acceleration when it comes to the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, the rate of growth of employment is just the difference between the rate of growth of GDP and the rate of growth of labor productivity. Now, if that is the case, then even if you have an acceleration in the rate of growth of GDP, everybody keeps talking about how GDP in India has become much greater in the neoliberal period compared to earlier. But in fact, the rate of growth of labor productivity has increased even faster, because of which the rate of growth of employment is actually less today than it was in the period of planning in the pre-neoliberal period. Roughly speaking, you have a 1% rate of growth of employment every year in India, while earlier it was about 2%. Now, if you have 1% rate of growth of employment every year, that is even lower than the natural rate of growth of the workforce, because your population growing at about 1.5%, workforce growth would be at least 1.5%, and therefore, let alone absorbing the peasants, which I was talking about, who come from the countryside in order to work in the towns, the rate of growth of employment is not even enough to absorb the natural rate of growth of the workforce. Therefore, what you have is a swelling of labor reserves, or a rise in what Marx would have called the reserve army of labor, that really there is a massive swelling of the reserve army of labor. It doesn't necessarily take the form of open unemployment. What it basically means is that a same amount of work gets distributed among more people. While earlier one person may be working for 8 hours, had a job working for 8 hours, now what you find is that 2 people, each getting half a wage, would actually be working for 4 hours in order to do the same job. So there is a swelling of the reserve army of labor, and along with the swelling of the reserve army of labor, you actually have an increase in absolute poverty, because peasant agriculture has actually become unviable. Whole lot of people in the petty production sector have actually become now experience much lower levels of income, and that being the case, obviously there is an absolute impoverishment as far as that entire segment is concerned. I need hardly say that if you have a rise in labor reserves, then even the unionized workers find it very difficult to raise their level of wages, because their bargaining power is considerably constrained. Jobs themselves, instead of being permanent, become casualized, and that being the case, you actually find that even the real wages of the organized workers, unionized workers, even they don't increase. Now, if the real wages of the even unionized workers don't increase, but the real incomes of vast segments of the other sectors of the working population go down, that basically implies an absolute impoverishment of the working population. Now, this is something for which you have some data, though I believe economists have not really woken up to this fact sufficiently. If you look at the calorie intake, the per capita, in India in the old days, when poverty studies began in 1973-74, poverty was defined in terms of the following criteria. Anybody in rural India who did not have access to 2200 calories per person per day was considered poor. Anybody in urban India who did not have access to 2100 calories per person per day was considered poor. Now, if you simply use that criterion, then you find that between 1993-4, which is the first year after the introduction of neoliberal policies in India, when the NSS held a large sample survey, between 93-94 and 2011-12, the proportion of the rural population not accessing 2200 calories per person per day went up from 58% to 68%. In urban India, the proportion not accessing 2100 calories per person per day went up from 57% to 65%. Therefore, there's plenty of evidence to show that there is, in fact, an absolute impoverishment that is taking place. And of course, this impoverishment arises because also of the rise in prices of a number of goods, including in particular services like education and health, which have become much more expensive now because they are privatized. There are innumerable stories of peasants coming from Uttar Pradesh in order to treat their child, let us say. They come to Delhi per force. They go to some private hospital where they pay through their noses. They have to sell their land back home in the village in order to meet the expenses of the child's health care. But at the end of it, even the child does not often survive. So the sheer tragedy of it is something which is really kind of unimaginable. But on the other hand, therefore, the point I'm trying to make is that there is an increase in the proportion of absolute poverty which is associated with this. There is, however, now, as therefore the real incomes of the working people, when I talk about working people, I mean the peasants, the workers, the agricultural laborers, the fishermen, the craftsmen, the petty producers, and so on, all of them I put under the rubric of the working people. So if you have the per capita incomes of the working people not rising, for many of them the per capita incomes fall. For others, like even unionized workers, they don't rise. But at the same time, labor productivity is rising. Now that basically implies that the share of surplus, which is the labor productivity minus the real wage multiplied by the number of workers, the share in total output, the share of surplus in total output tends to increase. Now this is something which has been talked about by many people, because one manifestation of the rise in the share of surplus is the increase in income inequality. Everybody from Piketty downwards is talking about the increase in income inequality, so much so that now the World Economic Forum at Davos is also talking about the rise in income inequality. So the rise in income inequality that occurs is, to my mind, precisely a reflection of the fact that when labor productivity has gone up, real incomes of the working people, per capita real income of the working people, have not gone up. Now there is a third feature of neoliberalism that I want to draw your attention to, and that's the following: that when you have, let us say, because of the mobility of capital across country borders, we know that relocation happens. Now American companies locate their plants not necessarily in America, they locate it in Indonesia, they locate it in China, they locate it in Vietnam, and so on, because of the relocation of production facility. Capital has become global, not just finance I was talking about earlier, but capital in production, productive capital, what you call direct foreign investment, that has now become global. Now if capital in production has become global, then it demolishes the bargaining strength of workers everywhere. If the American workers go on strike demanding higher wages, in that case, the employer would say, all right, you people are on strike, I'm going to locate my plant in Indonesia, because there I get lower wages and the workforce there is not on strike. therefore, the very fact of the cross-border mobility of capital in production is a factor that considerably weakens the bargaining strength of workers all over the world, not just in our countries, all over the world. As a matter of fact, Joseph Stiglitz, the economist, made a calculation according to which between 1968 and 2011, I mean, just take these two endpoints, you found that the real wage of a male American worker had not increased but had marginally declined but marginally lower in 2011. Now, obviously, and you know, this is something which many others have talked about. I don't have time to give you all the various data, but many others have talked about, including Branko Milanovic, who has done fairly exhaustive studies of income distribution, changes in income distribution in the world. So, now if therefore you have a situation where the American workers' wages now cannot rise because the Indian or the Bangladeshi or the Indonesian workers' wages are much lower, and if the American workers' wages rose, then capital would simply shift from there to here. You find then that basically the American workers' wages get linked to what you find in the third world, and what is more, therefore they become subject to the baneful effects of the huge labor reserve that exists in the third world. That these labor reserves, in other words, not only constrain the real wages of workers here, but they also constrain the real wages of workers everywhere. Okay? Therefore, this rise in the share of surplus is something which is not only confined to a country like India or only to the third world, it is something that happens in the world as a whole. If you take world output and if you take the real wage bill of the world output, then you find that the share of surplus in world output rises. Now that, of course, one consequence which we have discussed is the rise in income inequality. But the second consequence is something which I want to really draw your attention to, and that is the fact that if you shift a rupee from a worker to a rich man, let us say, to the capitalist, in that case, the worker was more or less consuming that entire rupee. Okay, you give it to the capitalist, that capitalist may consume 50 paise out of it and put the remaining 50 paise in pocket, saying, I'll spend it tomorrow. Okay, now that's the same as economists say of the marginal propensity to consume of the workers being higher than that of the capitalists. Therefore, every such redistribution has the effect of reducing the level of consumption that would have otherwise happened. So that you think of a trajectory of development and you have a shift in income distribution along that trajectory, then that trajectory would actually be overcome by a tendency towards overproduction because of the fact that the consumption would then be falling and falling and falling. The old trajectory of consumption cannot be maintained. Therefore, the tendency to overproduction crisis is something which is a part of the neoliberal economy. Now you may say, how does it matter if there is a tendency to overproduction crisis? Because of the fact that after Keynes we all know how to deal with overproduction crisis, namely that increased government spending. With increased government spending, the ex-ante overproduction crisis need not be an ex-post overproduction crisis. You can actually have the government spending going up, and that being the case, that you would actually prevent the precipitation of any actual crisis. Now, here, however, if you have a rise in government spending, for that rise in government spending to boost aggregate demand, which is what Keynes was talking about, that rise must be financed in one of two ways. It must be financed either by taxing the rich or by taxing the capitalists, or it must be financed entirely through a fiscal deficit. Why? Because the third way of financing is by taxing the working people. But if you tax the working people in order to spend more, for the government to spend more, in that case, suppose you take a rupee from the working people, their consumption goes down by a rupee, the state expenditure goes up by a rupee, there is no net addition to aggregate demand. So the net addition to aggregate demand requires that this aggregate demand and the state expenditure fiscal deficit, then you're not taxing anybody, or through a tax on the capitalist or on the rich generally, because then, taking my earlier example, you tax them by 1 rupee, their consumption goes down by 50 paise, because the other 50 paise was being saved by them anyway. But on the other hand, expenditure by the state goes up by a rupee, so there's a net increase in aggregate demand of 50 paise. Therefore, the only ways in which the state can possibly make a difference to prevent this ex-ante overproduction crisis from becoming an ex-post overproduction crisis is by financing by spending more, but financing this larger spending by either a fiscal deficit or by taxing the rich, both of which are not allowed under neoliberalism. Obviously, instead of taxing the rich, on the contrary, various governments are advised that if your economy is getting into a crisis, then please give more money to the capitalists. If you give more money to the capitalists, they want to invest more and get you out of the crisis. But capitalists don't invest more if they get more money. As a matter of fact, as you know, investment function basically depends upon the expected rate of growth of demand. If you have a stagnant economy, there's no investment other than what is required for replacement. Now, if you give more money to the capitalists, that is something which is not going to make them invest anymore because the market is not growing. Therefore, taxing the capitalists and the government spending this is something which is out of the question. And likewise, fiscal deficit, government spending through a fiscal deficit is also out of the question. Why it is out of the question is a very deep question, to my mind, is the deepest question in economics, to which I don't want to spend any time. But on the other hand, as you all know, we actually have laws, not just we, all over the world, except in the United States, there are laws saying that the fiscal deficit must not exceed 3% of the GDP. Now you ask yourself, why isn't there a law saying that education expenditure must not fall below 6% of GDP? Why isn't there a law saying that the tax revenue from, let's say, wealth taxation must not fall below so much percent of the GDP? But there is a law. Even in India, we have the FRBM, which actually says that fiscal deficit must not rise above 3% of the GDP of the central government and 3% of state governments in India, while in the European Union, it is just 3% of all countries. Therefore, fiscal deficit is not allowed, and this 3% is basically an innovation on an earlier system that used to prevail in the gold standard years and so on, where it was 0%. Governments were asked to balance their budgets, while now they're not asked to balance their budgets, but they're allowed a little bit of leeway, which is 3% of the GDP. So the only way that the government can intervene in order to boost aggregate demand and prevent the ex-ante overproduction crisis from becoming exposed is something which is denied under neoliberalism, which is why the neoliberal economy necessarily moves towards a crisis. Now, this crisis may be delayed a little bit, which it was because of what are called asset price bubbles in the 1990s. There was the dot-com bubble in the United States where the prices of the dot-com equity stocks really increased. When there is such a bubble, people feel rich and they spend some amount, and therefore real demand also increases. That can prevent the overproduction crisis from manifesting itself. When the dot-com bubble collapsed, there was the housing bubble in the United States, which collapsed in 2008, after which there has been no comparable bubble. You cannot hold a gun to people's heads and say that form a bubble, because after all, the very collapse of the housing bubble has actually made people much more chary, much more careful, and as a result, no comparable bubble has taken place, which is why the crisis is now upon us. Now, the basic point I want to emphasize is that this crisis is one against which it is not possible within the neoliberal parameters to actually find any solution, which is a big difference from the 1930s. I'll come to that in a moment. Now, if therefore we are going to be stuck with much higher levels of unemployment, and this is going to give rise to, at the world level, in various countries, to upsurges among workers. Britain is the most obvious case. You must be seeing the papers. The railway workers are striking. Even in Germany, which is the most prosperous of the European countries, the airlines workers are on strikes. Therefore, all over Europe, you have a resurgence of strikes which had disappeared after the 1970s. You never had such a spate of strikes as you are now having. So if you have, therefore, a crisis that does not go away because the government cannot intervene within the parameters of neoliberalism to overcome the crisis, in that case, typically, the way that in various countries, the ruling oligarchy is trying to cope with the crisis, to defend itself against the crisis, is by forming an alliance with neo-fascism. Now, this is something which you find all over the world. This fascist tendency is not just confined to India, it is there all over the world. You look at Poland, you look at Hungary, you look at even in France, Marine Le Pen. This tendency is there everywhere. In some places they're in power, in other places they're not. Trump was in power but had to leave, but on the other hand, he may well come back. So there is an upsurge of fascism all over the world. And you ask yourself the question, why? Why should there be an upsurge of fascism? By the way, the fascist party in the United Kingdom, which is called UKIP, has now really infiltrated the Tory party in a very big way, so much so that Liz Truss, who became Prime Minister yesterday, was up, it's a miles move to the right, because there has been a significant shift in the composition of the Conservative Party. So there's an upsurge of fascism all over the world. Now you ask yourself the question, why should there be this upsurge of fascism? I believe that this upsurge of fascism all over the world is precisely because of the crisis of neoliberalism. Precisely because of the fact that neoliberalism has got into a dead end where it can no longer have the high rates of growth it used to have earlier. Earlier, it derived its legitimation from the fact that it was having a high growth rate, and it was generally, despite the impoverishment I was referring to earlier, people had this illusion that, look, okay, the bad times for us, but for my child it's going to be okay because it will trickle down. Eventually, if you keep having such high growth rates are bound to trickle down. But on the other hand, the moment even these growth rates come to an end, you need an alternative prop for the neoliberal order. That alternative prop is provided through a neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance. Mikhail Kaletsky, whom you must be studying, had actually defined classical fascism in the 1930s as an alliance between big business and the fascist upstarts. These days you have an alliance between neoliberalism, which is the corporate financial oligarchy in each country. They are of course all integrated into the globalized finance that I was talking about, and of course neo-fascist elements. Neo-fascist elements are there. In every modern society you have neo-fascist elements. You have Ku Klux Klan, you have all kinds of such organizations. But they remain in the political fringes of society. They move center stage only when they are supported by big business, only when big business supports them through media, through finance, and so on. Therefore, what I'm talking about is the neoliberal, neo-fascist alliance, which is a really characteristic feature of our contemporary period in country after country. Now, when this happens, there are many characteristics of this alliance, which I'll just very briefly like to mention before passing on. One of them, of course, is, as I said, that behind it is not only the support of big business, but this entire arrangement is meant to further the interests of big business. We all know how they do that. The second thing, of course, is that it is authoritarian. It uses the apparatus of the state against any kind of resistance of the workers, resistance of the peasants, and so on, which is, of course, a common feature of fascism. The third, which is very important, is the fact that fascism always singles out the other, which is some hapless minority group. It can be a religious minority, as in India. It can be an ethnic minority, the blacks. It can be a social minority like the immigrants in Britain and so on. So it always kind of identifies the other as a hapless minority group, and then arouses the hatred of the majority against this minority, holding it responsible for all the ills of society, and particularly the crisis through which society is passing. So this otherization is the third important feature of fascism. And the fourth, of course, is that fascism does not only rely, it's a bit different in fascism and authoritarianism, fascism and Bonapartism. Fascism does not only rely on the organs of the state for repression, but it also has its own hoodlum army, which actually is unleashed on the population. Mussolini had one. I mean, all fascist governments, all fascist movements have their own hoodlum armies. Therefore, you have now all over the world, and this is in fact a symptom of the dead end of neoliberalism, that the corporate financial oligarchy is forced to make common cause, make alliances with neo-fascist elements for protecting, defending, promoting its own interests against possible threats from the working class or the working people in our country, the working people, the peasantry, and so on. Now, the last point I want to make is that there's a big difference between classical fascism of the 1930s and contemporary neo-fascism. I call it neo because obviously it's not the same. And that difference consists in the following: that Hitler came to power in 1933. In Japan, you had even earlier the emergence of a military fascist government. Now, when Hitler came to power, there's an interesting article by Kaleski, which you must read, stimulating business upswing in Nazi Germany. When he came to power in Germany, what he did was that he actually used borrowing in order to stimulate government spending. Borrowing is the same as fiscal deficit, for military purposes. Military expenditure went down. In Japan, even earlier, in 1931, Japan was the first country to come out of the Great Depression of the 30s, and it did so by stimulating military spending, which was again financed by borrowing. So those governments, and likewise Hitler came out of Germany came out of the Depression, Nazi Germany came out of the Depression by borrowing and using the funds to finance military spending. Therefore, they reached full employment fairly early. While all capitalist countries were submerged in full employment, the fascist countries like Germany and Japan had come out of unemployment. And in other words, while all were submerged in unemployment, you actually had Germany and Japan and so on really coming to full employment. There was therefore a period roughly of about 6 years or so between 1933 and 39 in Germany, between 1931 and let us say somewhere around 37, 38 in Japan. 37 is when they marched into China, Manchuria. But roughly there was a period when the horrors of war had not intervened, but on the other hand, full employment had been reached. No matter how, but it had been reached. Therefore, the fascist governments were quite popular during that period because they had actually, taken these countries out of the throes of unemployment. Contemporary fascism is not capable of doing that because contemporary fascism cannot overcome the contradiction between the nation state on the one hand and globalized finance. They cannot enlarge their expenditures by borrowing because that would mean fiscal deficit, which is not allowed by globalized finance. Therefore, the ability of contemporary fascism to overcome unemployment is just not there. As a matter of fact, the other day you would notice that the first quarter GDP estimates in India for 2022 came out. And you find that in real terms, the expenditure, which actually has marginally declined in 2022 compared to 2018, 2019, that would be the comparable, is government consumption. In other words, that which we would be expecting should be growing the most in order to get the economy out of unemployment is the one which actually marginally has declined. Therefore, the contemporary governments, even fascist governments, neo-fascist governments, are really incapable of overcoming the crisis to which neoliberalism has sunk. But now this is two very important implications. The first implication is that the possibility of neo-fascism imploding, as it were, through war, as had happened in the 1930s, is of course not as strong today, is not there. But on the other hand, overthrowing, because of course contemporary neo-fascism does not completely abandon the democratic shell. There are elections and so on, but overthrowing such governments through elections is something which again would not work, because even if perchance you manage to do it, then unless those governments, new governments that come to power, are governments that get away from the neoliberal policies, then the fascists would be back in power. You see, so like in an earlier era, when the emergency was overthrown, you had a new government, but fairly soon Mrs. Gandhi came back into power. But because the government that had come in the place of Mrs. Gandhi's government had really made its own instability absolutely apparent. So the way of fighting contemporary neo-fascism is to overcome the conjuncture that produces neo-fascism. This conjuncture is, I'm not saying immediately, I'm not saying that this is something that has to be done as a condition for overthrowing neo-fascism, but on the other hand, the struggle against neo-fascism cannot be complete unless you transcend the conjuncture of neoliberalism. Now that is something which is, of course, not easy, because neoliberalism has the support of the advanced capitalist countries. They would immediately impose sanctions upon you and so on. But on the other hand, this is something which the working people in the world, particularly working people in the third world, have to learn to have to learn to cope with. They have got to understand this. And of course, all of us who are students and teachers and so on, we must understand that the fight against fascism is not just one of getting rid of one government having another, but really is one of getting rid of a whole underlying conjuncture which is characterized by neoliberalism. Thank you very much.